All right, thanks everyone for coming. You'll see that my slides are kind of interesting, and we'll get to that later, but I actually made a game out of all my slides, so we'll go over that. So we'll start them up. So yeah, as we just heard, this is making visual novels with Ren'Py, and my name is Briar Rose. I'm at that weird word on Twitter, so if you look up Ubiquil on Twitter or on most things like GitHub, you will find me. And then this talk also contains a mysterious voice. But what exactly is this mysterious voice? Seems to know a lot about me, I guess. Knows where I work. So I work at Crowd Compass as an Android engineer. So my day-to-day work is creating Android apps, but I get kind of bored with that sometimes, and sometimes I want to build other things, and this is one of my hobbies. I also work with Stumptown Syndicate. Oh yeah. So as part of ResFest, which this event is a part of, Stumptown Syndicate is organizing a documentary film night, which is going to be at Crowd Compass on Tuesday, October 4th at 6:30. I think I might have the wrong time on the next. Yep. So it's actually at 6:30 is when the doors will open, and that's the address. Everyone's welcome. It's free. So if you want to come by and watch a movie and have some popcorn, I'd love to have you come and join me. So thank you, Mysterious Voice. It's kind of creepy. It knows all this about me. So yeah, who is this mysterious voice? Well, some sort of raccoon that's not out to get me. So it's going to help me demonstrate Ren'Py. So as I said, this is the engine for creating visual novels that I'm going to be talking about. So I felt the best way to show it off was to have a talk where my slides had a personality and could talk back, because it can actually be a character. So I originally got interested in visual novels because I was very interested in the 90s culture of zines, which, if you haven't heard, they're DIY, self-published booklets on all sorts of things, anything that you could possibly think of. And because of that, because they're so easy to print through copy machines as those became more proliferated in the 80s, people were able to create very niche topics that might not have been published by larger publishers or gotten the same sort of market share. So the types of stories that got told in those would be much more on the fringe of society or marginalized voices who couldn't as often have those pieces said, which really speaks to me because I've always been a big fan of folk music and the folk tradition, and I feel like zines embody that, where you can copy one zine and you can take pieces of it and you can remix it into something new. And once you have this new element of this new piece of art, then you can put that out in the world and other people can continue to do the same. And there's been really interesting changes as we've gone into the digital age to allow us to do the similar thing. We've seen that with remix tracks. A lot of hip-hop music, of course, is going to pull in samples from various things. And I'm always on the lookout for ways that I can incorporate that in projects that I'm working on. And it doesn't happen enough in technology, I feel like. We pull in libraries, but we don't necessarily have an ongoing story that we're telling a history of a people or anything like that inside of our technology. So I got really interested in visual novels because of that. So if you've ever seen a game that looks like the format that's on the screen up there, that's what a visual novel looks like. If you've ever seen that in any game, it's probably on the spectrum of a visual novel. This is a really funny visual novel, which I found out on Wikipedia the other day. The Wikipeton, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. That's actually the anthropomorphic version of Wikipedia that goes on missions and is the embodiment of a Wikipedia as it goes through different missions. There's like 30 different pages on Wikipedia about this character. So if you ever want to do that, and it's all in the public domain, so you can use that character for your own graphic novels if you'd like. So there's some interesting facts about visual novels. If you've seen a version of this game, you probably know that you can go through and it tells you a story as you click through, and there's different characters that can talk to you. And there's all sorts of different versions on this. And this originally came from a lot of other types of media that have been in the past. So see if Rin knows anything about the history of visual novels. So it's a manifestation of a talking raccoon and knows all sorts of facts. So So in 2006, 70% of PC games were actually visual novels. Were they the best sellers? Probably not, but they're very common, and there's a lot of them out there, and there still is today. It's also a natural progression from the choose-your-own adventure books that you might have read when you were younger, or you might still read today. I think they're pretty fun, where you can read a chapter, then at the end of the chapter it says, oh, do you choose A or B? And if you choose B, turn to page 132, and then you flip there and you follow that. But that's kind of limiting, because let's say you read a page and you can either pick up a lucky coin, you can shake someone's hand, or you can try to go out on a date with someone. And all of those are going to either affect your luck, your charisma, or some other stat, and then depending on those stats, 5 chapters later, wherever that stat is, it's going to affect the outcome of what's happening. That'd be really hard to keep that sort of like spreadsheet going on your computer or in your notebook as you read through a book to try to follow your path through all of this. But if you're doing it inside of programming, it can keep all of that up for you. So some of my favorite visual novels, and you might have heard of some of these, are Depression Quest, which is a game that will walk you through what it's like to be in the mind of a person who is suffering from depression. It does that, or attempts to do that, by giving you options for how you might deal with depression. And you can always see a clear path out of that depression, but that option is never available to you. So you are continuing to go through, and it's supposed to simulate that to give people a better idea of what depression is, which is a pretty interesting idea for a game. And it's all done through these visual novel techniques. Another one, which is my favorite, is called Choice of Robots. It's a visual novel in which you play a scientist at MIT, and you start going through the ranks, and it's kind of up to you as an engineer and how you're going to build robots. Are you going to build them for the military? Are you going to build them for the advancement of science? Are you going to destroy all of them because you're worried about the future of mankind? And depending on what you do, it plays out the next, I think, 100 years of society and what happens with those robots. And I think there's around, I don't remember the exact number, but there's many, 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 many outcomes. So it's really interesting, and you can go down all those different paths. Long Live the Queen is a really popular game. Now, with this one, it doesn't necessarily have a specific branch story structure that it goes through. Instead, it's more of a cycle in which you make some changes, your stats get adjusted, and then you go through one step, and then you adjust your stats again, and then you go through a step, and that cycle keeps going. And that's a very popular type of game, and that's another example of something that could be built in these visual novel engines. A newer game that came out recently is We Know the Devil. It's a really great game, and I'm using it as an example because I really enjoyed it. Plus, it's a great game for the queer community, which it was built by queer people for queer people, and it's kind of an interesting story where, as I was saying before, with zines and with this type of culture to be able to spread those ideas, where they might not get published by EA or another place like that, it gives an outlet where people can share their experiences with others. So a more common one that you might have heard of before is Professor Layton. While it does have cutscenes in it and puzzles, all the different actions that you go through are really just point and click. They're really just the same sort of branched story structure where you answer A or B, and you go left or right, and then you talk to new people. And then probably the most famous example that I could think of a visual novel is the Phoenix Wright games, where you are actually an anime attorney, and you are supposed to go to court. So all of the different visual novel aspects are actually going through a crime scene, trying to remember as much as you can, and then you're in the court, and you have to try to remember all the facts from that piece of the case. And depending on how you answer, you'll either win the court case or you'll lose. So it's your job to try to figure out who is guilty and to make sure that the right person is either found guilty or innocent. So if I want to make games like this, I'm going to need something that can help me with that, because while I think I'm a pretty good programmer, I don't have enough time to necessarily go through and build all the infrastructure for one of these games. And that's where something like Ren'Py comes in. So Ren'Py is an open source. There's the web address. It's an open source visual novel engine, which will allow you to create these. If you look in the Android App Store, the iOS App Store, on Twitch, all of these different platforms have many games that were made in the Ren'Py engine. So it's not just something that like you might hear like, oh yeah, that's a free game engine that you can go use, but it doesn't quite match up to what else is out there. Ren'Py is actually very common and it's used by many people. So you can make games that are of the same caliber of a lot of the other ones that are out there. While I'm sure that like any engine, it's gonna shine in some areas and not in others. It shines in a lot of the areas that make visual novels great, and it's been the engine of choice that a lot of people have used. So if you want to follow along during this talk, if you go to that URL at the bottom, renpy.org, and you download the Ren'Py SDK, you can actually code along with everything that we're doing. If you can't, it has a tutorial built into it when you get it, which is kind of sit down and you can go through. So if you want to come back to it later, it's all in there, it's all free, and you can step through it and kind of get a refresher on all of these things then. So the first thing that you want to do when you create a visual novel is you're presented with this. And this looks a little bit different than probably most Python IDEs. You get this Ren'Py launcher. And it's really easy to create a new project. You can see down at the bottom left of the screen, there's a Create New Project button. You just click that and you type in a name and you're ready to go. Once you do that, you'll see on the right side, it has a list of the different directories and files that are important to the system. So you'll get started with a game folder, a base folder, and an images folder. And you'll have files such as script.rpy, and I'll get into why that is not just .py in a minute. Options.rpy and screens.rpy. For the purpose of this talk, we're mostly going to be focused on the script.rpy. Most of your game is going to be inside of that file. So if you click on the script.rpy file, you'll actually it will either launch its internal editor or your system editor, and you can start editing the file. If you use VI or Emacs, there are different syntax plugins available to be able to have syntax highlighting for the RPY extension. So the first thing that you'll probably want to do when you're building a visual novel is you're probably going to want to add some dialogue. So to add dialogue, everyone wants to know too, it's fairly simple. There's a few different things you'll see in our script, and this is pretty much the simplest Ren'Py script that you can write. You'll notice a few things that are similar to Python. The syntax is similar with blocks and with the indentation. So at the beginning of any Ren'Py game, you will actually be jumping into the label entitled start. And I'll show a little bit more about what labels do, but really they're just blocks of code. A lot of Ren'Py uses a system that's very similar to goto statements. So you're actually going to jump around between all of your labels. So at the beginning of our game, we're going to jump into label start. And then the first thing it does is it has a string that says hello world, and that's actually going to print out our dialogue of hello world. So you'll get this screen if you run that game. It's kind of boring. There's really not much there, but you have hello world, and you've written your first Ren'Py game. But we want to do a little bit more. So we can add more in there. And on this one, you'll notice that it has two strings that are available. The first one is going to be our character name, and the other one is going to be what that character is saying. So if we were to run this, where it has princess in quotes, and then what the princess is saying, then we get this, where it says princess as hello world. But it's still a little boring, and the code seems kind of obtuse. Like I don't want to have to write quote princess quote every single time I want this character to speak. So there's an easier way to do that. You can actually create a character and define it, and then you can just define it as a letter. And then because you're going to be doing so much dialogue, they recommend, Ren'Py recommends that you use a single character, which I know is not up to PEP 8 standards, but it's gets the job done for this. So you can make it longer if you'd like. And then you can do the exact same thing that we just did. So if we run that, we get the exact same output that we had before. But still, it's a little boring. We could probably spice that up a little bit. So if we take the exact same thing and we add in the color argument, then we can actually change the color of our name tag that is on our character. So now when I run it, it's not the best color choice for the screen, I guess, but that's actually pink now instead of white. So you can do that, and you can set it to any hex code for a color. So now we can have all these different characters that we define, and we can have them talk to each other, and we can separate them visually by having different colors on their names to help differentiate between who those different characters are. So that can get like kind of boring if all we have is the text. We probably want to make sure that we have images as well. But they're pretty easy too. So if we wanted to add a background to our game, say we wanted to add a city background, this is all we'd have to do. So we're going to define an image. Image is a keyword in Ren'Py. And then you have two different variable names after that. The first one is a category, and the second one is the variable name for the image. So for all background images, they have the category of BG. You can define your own set outside of that as well, but BG is for most of the background images. And then we add our image to the images folder, which we saw in the launcher. So it's pretty straightforward. And then you just put that file name in quotes. And then we do the same thing. And then to make it show up, because it's a background image, we're going to call scene. And then we put in the category and the variable name. And then that should show that scene background. And then we're going to print hello world again. So let's see what that looks like. So, I didn't actually print hello world in the actual version that I finished up on RAM. But you can see the image. But the image is very, very stretched. It doesn't look much like a city. So you can actually use this built-in method. You don't have to import anything. It just comes with the Ren'Py script where you can use IM that has all the different methods on it that you can run on images. And a very common one is scale. And that just takes the file name and then the height and width. And so then when we have that, we can actually fit the image to the size. And because the default for Ren'Py is 800 by 600, we can make sure that our image fills the space then. So let's try that one. That looks a lot better. So that actually looks like an image instead of just the weird blurriness that was there before. So, but we still need to help out Ren. So Ren needs a body. So how are we going to do that? So that's a little bit different. For that, we have the category of Ren instead of BG. Like I said, you can define your own. I could really put anything here that I wanted. And then I'm just going to have this be the default image. You can call it whatever you want. You could have smiling, you could have sad, you could have surprised, you could have upside down, whatever you want that image to be. Then you would put all the separate images in there, and then you could switch. So if Ren was having a happy day and then you wanted like something bad to happen to Ren because you're evil for some reason, then you would want to switch it over from the happy to the sad. So once we have that set up, we're going to use scale again, and we're going to make it a little bit smaller because we don't want our character to fill up the whole screen. We're going to call show, and then the category and the variable name. So when we do that, show is going to bring up that image, but it's not going to set it as the scene for the background. It's going to set it just on top of that on a layer. So if we run that, then we have our character there. But there's going to be a problem if we have our character just right in the center, which is I want to show these slides as we're going through and the different code snippets, and that's going to get in the way. So we need to have a plan. If we do this, there's these different keywords that you can add in for the position, where you can just say at left, at right, and you can actually define these as well, which is what I've actually done with the window screenshot that's on there, where you can define your own positioning on the screen, which I can show you later if you'd like. But you can specify where on the screen you would like that character to be. So this is the same thing, but we're going to have Ren show up at left. So when we do that, Ren is now on the left side of the screen. So then we have our background. Ren pops in, but we keep making Ren just pop into existence, and that's not very nice. So let's see what else we can do with Ren. So we can do these transformations where we can actually bring Ren in and out of existence, or the background in and out of existence. So yeah, we transitioned Ren out of existence. So let's bring Ren back. See that Ren faded in that time, so it's a little bit safer. So the way that we do that is you can see that there's the show, which is the same on this one. But the hide, when we hide Ren, which is just the opposite of show, so we're going to take Ren away, would normally just pop Ren out of existence. we added this extra line below it with pixelate. And pixelate is one of the transitions. There's about 30 different ones that you can use that are built in, and you can write your own. And then when it does the hide, it will use that transition on the object that you're hiding or showing. So you could use pixelate to pixelate in an object or pixelate out an object. Another version is when Ren came back, I showed Ren again, and then I used the dissolve to make Ren fade in. So that's all fine. Like, we can have all this animation in there, but if we really want to make this a game where we can actually choose what we would like to do, to have those options of choosing A and B, then we need to have buttons and we need to be able to choose those. So this is what I was talking about with the labels. We can actually have different labels. So you can see I added in a label 1 at the bottom. And this is just a different block that we can jump to through the execution. So here it's going to jump to 1. So this is pretty straightforward. Oops, let me go back. So when the game starts, it's going to launch a menu, which is going to have us choose either the option 1 or the option 2. If the player chooses 1, then it's going to jump to 1, which will print out the dialogue, you chose 1. If you choose 2, then it will just print out the dialogue, you chose 2 without jumping. So let's give that a try. Oh, actually, before we give it a try, this is the exact same thing, but it's probably a better way to write it. With this, we have our menu, and we have choice 1 and choice 2. And then this $sign here, we're going to get to in just a second, but you can actually put Python code after that. So then we have a variable called myChoice, and then we can either assign 1 or 2 to it, and then we can print it out by putting square brackets around it, and then it'll just tell us what it is. So that's the one we're actually going to execute. So we do that. We have 1 and 2. Let's select 2. And I chose 2. And then I can click back at the bottom. And the buttons that are at the bottom here come with Ren'Py. That's just built in. You can customize those further, but that's just what's there. So let's jump back. And this time I'm going to choose 1. And it says that I chose 1. So we know that the button can have 2 different paths and have different outcomes depending on what we choose. So for Python, like I was just talking about, that $sign on any line is for a single line of Python. So you can see I have that at the very top under the label. We have a variable which we're assigning a string to that. Then we're going to have it print out this string, which is going to print out my_var is, then it's going to print out the contents of that variable. But sometimes you want more than a single line. So for that, you can create a Python block. So with that, you just write the word Python. It's pretty simple, colon, and then indent everything you would like inside of that. And then you can actually do multiple lines of Python. So in here, I'm going to take the existing string, and I'm going to cut off the beginning of it. So it's just line Python, and I'm going to add on multi. So it'll be multi-line Python, and then it should print out my var is multi-line Python. So you can see at the bottom, it did the first one. My var is one line Python. But then my var is multi-line Python. And then sometimes when you are creating your game, you're going to want to store information. And there is a save state, so you can actually right-click, and that's the default. You have all these slots where you can store stuff, and that's pretty nice persistence, and that's just built in. What that does is whatever state you're in the game on those labels, it just stores that, and it has all that information as well as all the variable state, and it's going to just store all of that in Ren'Py. You get that for free, and you don't have to do anything. But sometimes you might want to store something where when you play the game, the player does an action, and then the next time that they've quit the game and restarted and started playing again, maybe it remembers some of the choices that they made and goes through that. One game that came out recently that does that is Undertale. If anyone's played that, it remembers some of the choices that you made when in your previous playthrough. So you can do the exact same thing in Ren'Py. So in order to do that, oh, and this is an example. This screen, since I set this up, has run 15 times. So if I go back, and then I go back to that screen, it's now run 16 times. And that's from all the different times that I have run this through. So if I were to run that, all the times it's run on this system, I've run it 16 times now. So I could continue to run it, and that number will just keep going up regardless of which playthrough of the game I'm in. So in order to do this, there is a variable that Ren'Py gives you, which is global, called persistent. And then you can just define on that any variables that you want, and that will be stored outside. So in this one, I have a Python block in which I'm saying that if there is a persistent runs variable, then we're going to add one. Otherwise, we'll just set it to 1. So, oh, I actually made a mistake in there. It should be if it doesn't exist. But the code worked in my brain. So then it'll tell you if it's run and the number of runs. So yeah, so if the variable didn't exist yet, it would be 1. And then on each following run after that, it would be adding 1 to that. So let's say you want to distribute your game now that you've created this. This is the best part about Ren'Py, because this is the most annoying thing to me when I want to create these different things and get them out in the world. What platform do you want to put it on? How, like, what engine are you going to use? How are you going to get that onto those different spaces? Well, because Ren'Py is so popular, it runs on a lot of different things. If you click Build Distributions right here after you have it all set up, you can build it for Mac, you can build it for Windows, you can build it for Linux. You can build it for Android if you install the Android SDK. There will, of course, be differences in the gameplay depending on what sort of mechanisms you put in there. For all the stuff we went over, everything should work on every platform. For iOS, you can build it. Same limitations as Android. But you should be able to run all the stuff we went through, as well as sound, as well as movies. So if you want to run cutscenes, you could put those into your game. But there are other things you can add as well. You can run through a mini game if you want, and you can add that to the middle of your game by writing that in Python. And you can have that, depending on the player's score in the game, you can have a different outcome. So you can place those in there. And some of those, depending on the mechanics that you use in that, may or may not be available on some of those platforms. And then once you have those output, you can then add it to the Play Store. You can add it to the iOS App Store. You can go on to itch.io and maybe even Steam, and you can distribute your game out to all of these different places. So before we get to questions, let me jump back because I have a minute and I want to show everyone. Let's see if I have it. Whoop. Screen resized. Oh no. Well, if you open up the tutorial, it will have, let me see if I can. That looks better. Yeah, when I plugged it in up here, it didn't quite. So if I run, this is the basic tutorial that the game comes with. And like I said, it's really good for reading through. Let me get here. So we can actually add things, and I just want to show you some of the power of what this can do. If we jump into the mini games here, click around one. There we go. So you can actually play Pong in here. So I can move my paddle up and down, and then I can do that. The AI is going over there. So this can actually be built into the game, where then you can have your story bounce off that. So I lost, and the AI won there. So you can actually add that in, where you can have that in. You can imagine all sorts of different things. Like, that's not too different than the combat engine in Undertale, for example, where there's just different sprites flying around and you have to dodge them. That would use very similar mechanics to this. So you can see how putting these different things together can start to build out all of these different games. And if you've ever thought about being creative, or you feel like you have a story to tell, I want to tell you that this is a very, very easy way to put together a game to express yourself in those ways. I know that this is kind of small, but this is, for all my slides and all the different things I did, this is the entire amount of the source code here. So if I go through here, you can see here's the pieces talking. Here's the images that are defined. It's pretty straightforward. You can add some Python in there. So I think, yeah, the total file size of this is, let's see, about 300 lines. So you can put together a game fairly easy in which you can have that has animation, that has sound effects, that has your different character sprites, that can have all these different pathways as well as memory for all the different ways that go through it. And you're not going to have the fanciest 3D graphics with everything on there, but for a lot of stories, you don't need that because it's kind of hard to put together a whole graphics team to be able to build all of that for you. I was very lucky, and Madison actually built the raccoon for me, so I was able to get my character in there and get some help. You can also go to different places for the backgrounds. I just went to Google and I looked up images that were under reuse licenses. So you can get those. If you want to make a historical story, if you want to tell the story of Emma Goldman, all of her photos are in the public domain. So you could take those photos and you could pop out like the outside and drop her in the game and make her your character. And then you could just have older photos be your backgrounds because all of those are in the public domain. And then archive.org, of course, will be a good resource for the sounds and different things like that. There's also various libraries that people have put out there to help create those. But yeah, that's my presentation. And I hope to see people's games. If you do make them, please tell me about them. You can tweet at me, and I will be very happy and I will want to play them a lot. So please let me know if you do that. Thank you.